So we discussed FAPE and LRE, two of the elements of the IDEA. Remember that the IDEA is the foundation that special ed functions under. Think of the Individuals with Disability Act as the floor of the building, and then you need to put the pillars up to hold up the ceiling. So the first one is FAPE, and the next one is LRE. So we have a good start. It's rather humorous that one of the pieces discussed in the IDEA reauthorization was the lessening of paperwork. However, in special education, it's all about forms and documentation. So there's more work being done to automate these processes. For those of you that work in Lenawee County, you'll be familiar with Illuminate, possibly the web-based system that's now being used to put the IEPs together with. Many of the forms that we will be talking about are incorporated in the Illuminate system. It's a web-based system used by special educators throughout Lenawee County, and when a student is thought to be eligible for special ed, the system can be used from evaluation to the IEP. If you do your IEP observation in Lenawee County, you'll probably see it in action. So I just did a review to connect to the next part. We're going to talk about child find requirements, and that districts have the responsibility, remember, to locate, identify, and evaluate. And so how do they take care of these requirements? At this point, we know that the law mandates that school districts are required to provide students, including students with disability, between the ages of 3 and 21, or in Michigan, birth to 26. And how is this accomplished? It helps us to break the process down. So we're looking at identifying students, the old process versus the new process, evaluating students if a disability is suspected, and determining the eligibility, and that's working through the IEP team process with the MET team, which we're going to talk about. So let's begin at the beginning. So what has to happen first? Students have to be identified. And as I discussed in the lesson about history, it's important to understand what happened and why things have changed. So how was special education done in the past? Well, I can sort of speak to that because I taught under the old model, and I was there when the new model was coming up to see the dawning of the new age, so to speak. So the old model and how students used to be identified. It was a recommendation, special education evaluation, so it was Einstein's definition of insanity. And then the new model looks at recommendation, gathering information, problem solving, and a process called response to intervention. So we're going to start by talking about the old model. In many instances, a student in the general education classroom would be recommended because they were maybe a discipline problem. Like they'd say, oh, he can't behave in class, he or she must need to be in special education, or they would not be able to keep up and the class kept moving on. So a student would be recommended for special education. Oftentimes the teacher would say, I can't handle him, he must need special ed. So once a student was recommended for evaluation, the itinerant staff, which could be a school psychologist, a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, and a social worker, and they're called itinerant staff or support staff because they move around from school district to school district or building to building to help. So they would be brought in depending on what disability the teacher or team thought the student may qualify for. This would be decided based on information provided in the recommendation for testing. There would be cases where the evaluation would start with a focus on one disability, like they said the student maybe have a speech issue. And then they would determine later, based on more information and evaluation, that another disability may need to be looked at, possibly a learning disability. If during the testing for a learning disability, it was found that there was not a severe discrepancy, this is the old model, between the achievement of the student and the intellectual ability of a student. For example, a student might be in first grade in their third month, and they may be functioning or reading like on a kindergarten level, only performing at kindergarten level. So if they were assessed or evaluated, their responses would be what a kindergartner would be giving. And they were only able to perform work at that same level. The team may say there was not enough of a gap, a severe enough discrepancy. The student wasn't failing badly enough for us to determine that they were eligible. This is the old model. So the student might be in first grade functioning on a kindergarten level, but they weren't failing enough in order to get help. The student would receive no help and would return to the general education classroom. In many instances, that student would struggle along, sometimes be held back in that grade and potentially again in another grade. The student would struggle along through school unless they were recommended again and failing enough to be determined eligible and then placed in special ed. There were a number of students who never failed badly enough to ever be found eligible, so they struggled through. Some students finished, but there were many who finally gave up and never finished high school, never finished and graduated. My son was identified under the old model. He was in first grade and he was struggling, and we knew it at home. We were aware of it. We were working on things. And his teacher finally came to me, and I think she was a little bit nervous, and she said, "I think he needs to be tested." And I was like, "Yeah, I do too." But I knew what the model was, so I was waiting because I knew if we had tested him at the beginning that they wouldn't have found him, there wouldn't have been enough of a gap because he was so young. So he hadn't had time to, so to say, fail enough. So in our conversation, we agreed that we thought that because he was in first grade, there might not be enough of a discrepancy, but we decided to test him anyway. And he was found eligible with a reading, writing, and math disability, and he was placed in a special ed room for most of his day. So he had a really severe writing issue, hard time writing. It was hard to read his writing, really bad spelling, struggled in reading, was just having a really difficult time. So in the old model, just to look at it, there was identification, a recommendation of eligibility. The student maybe was a discipline problem or couldn't keep up in the classroom. So oftentimes the evaluation came about if there was a severe discrepancy, a big gap between achievement and intellectual functioning. And if the student was found, the student might be found eligible, but if they weren't, if they were found ineligible, they were returned to the general ed classroom and then nothing changed. They didn't get any extra help or supports. So they continued to fail. So the old method was Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So having the student identified but not enough of a discrepancy, they were placed back in the general ed classroom where they failed again, where they got recommended again, until eventually there was a big enough gap and then they got help. But by that time the student was so far behind it was difficult to catch them up, and they usually ended up being in special ed for the rest of their time in school. If a student was found not eligible for special ed services, there were no policies in place to require that educators find ways to support that student when they returned. If the teacher taught everyone in the same way and expected all of the students to be able to follow and progress, then that student was left on their own. Of course, there were always exceptions, and there would, of course, be those teachers that would find ways to work with students who were struggling, even though that was not a requirement. So, however, if the student then moved on to a teacher that did not do extra supports because it was the right thing to do, then the student was back to a fail, fail, fail situation. So the only way to provide assistance to a student that was struggling or at risk of failing was to find them eligible for special ed services, even if they only needed some support in the classroom and not specialized instruction. So this resulted in many students being identified who weren't really eligible for special education, so that they could get some kind of assistance. And it also took them out of the regular education classroom, which wasn't necessarily good. So there needed to be some changes. So at this point, enter response to intervention. In the definition of specific learning disabilities, it says a state must adopt, consistent with 300-309, criteria for determining whether a child has a specific learning disability as defined in 308. In addition, the criteria adopted by the state must not require the use of a severe discrepancy, between intellectual ability and achievement for determining whether a child has a specific learning disability, as defined in 308 8C10. It must permit the use of a process based on the child's response to scientific research-based interventions, and may permit the use of other alternative research-based procedures for determining whether a child has a specific learning disability. So that change came in one of the reauthorizations. The problem of over-identification and providing needed supports to those students that didn't need specialized instruction were addressed by adding in specification that the severe discrepancy was not required. You didn't have to use that in determining eligibility anymore. It could still be part of the information, but there had to be other methods. So in addition, the regulations added that the use of a child's response to interventions was a method that must be permitted. This method was found useful with students with disabilities, and so it has become part of the identification evaluation process for all eligibilities. So the new model provides research-based methods that have been proven to be successful. It moves away from the wait to fail model. It uses a problem-solving approach with the input of teachers to help solve the problem. It alleviates over-identification of children as being disabled when they did not receive appropriate education, and it's the right thing to do. It moves in the right direction and creates a great educational learning environment. So in any classroom, the majority of students are going to learn no matter what method the teacher incorporates. In many classrooms across the country, teachers use the lecture method to provide information in their classrooms. So if you look at this diagram starting at the bottom, the largest percentage of students need little or no extra interventions or assistance to learn what is being presented in the classroom. They may need a quick clarification, they may raise their hand and ask a question, it's answered, and they're good, they understand. So maybe the teacher does a quick review the next day of concepts from the day before, or maybe they show a video or use a diagram. That's enough to help someone in the class that was a little unclear about the information the day before. It's something the teacher just does as part of their normal teaching for the entire class. It's universal. It's not directed at one small specific group or an individual student. So with those methods, 80 to 90% of the students in a class will pick up the information. That's the big green section. The teacher gives a quiz on the information, and 80 to 90% of the students pass with an A, B, or C after the information was just given out. Out of the class, out of that group, 5 to 10% of the students will maybe get a D or an F. They will need a little extra something that's targeted learning, an experience on top of what the teacher did for the entire class, for that big group. Maybe an extra reading or a quick reteach of the lesson for that group of students that's not quite understanding the concepts. Once that's done, a few of those students may then pick up that concept and go, oh, okay, so that's the little yellow group. It's a targeted group intervention. Some students that might be at risk that need a little extra attention. But the teacher doesn't have to do a whole lot of different stuff. They may just have to take that small group and do a quick redo of the lesson. Out of those students, 1 to 5% of that group still may not understand the concept, and they're going to need to be provided with some individual help to grasp the information. Maybe there were 3 concepts being taught, and the teacher has to break the information down and teach one concept at a time and spend a couple days on each concept for that individual student or those 2 couple students who are still having difficulty. Once this is done, hopefully the students pass the test. This also flows the same kind of idea for behavior. 80 to 90% of kids mostly can, get along in the classroom. There's those few that need a little assistance and some that just have a hard time and can't handle it. End up in the office all the time. So in the old model, when the student had failed or was creating enough of a disturbance in the classroom they would have been referred for special education evaluation. They would have been tested, and it would have, if there was enough of a discrepancy, then they would have gone on for special ed services, and if not, they would have returned to the general ed classroom. Boom, done. Now, most school districts have a process in place to work with the student first to try to provide some support, find out what may work to keep the student in the classroom with some assistance, and not have to have specialized instruction, and not to fail. If the student would eventually be evaluated for special ed, the data from this process would be used. The focus would be to keep the student in the general education setting if possible. Research shows that keeping the student in the gen ed classroom, as long as it's the environment where they're going to receive the most educational benefit, increases their chances of success for graduation, for post-secondary education, or employment. However, this is not always the best placement for a student. That's what the team needs to determine based on the student's response to intervention. The student assistance team, and the name can be different depending on what school district or county you're in, it's a team that works through a problem-solving process to help the student. So, a student's having difficulty in one or more areas in the classroom, reading, math, writing, behavior. The teacher's provided some extra assistance, and the student's not able to grasp the concepts. So the teacher takes the case to the student assistance team to discuss the issue. That's kind of where the process starts. This is in the new model. The team usually has a consistent member that coordinates the meetings, oftentimes the school counselor or an administrator. The other members change depending on the student and their needs. The role of this group is to gather information and determine where to start in the response to intervention process. The teacher or the person that's bringing the student case to the team brings all of the information to the student assistance team. The problem is identified, like maybe the student is below grade level reading. The team determines if the teacher has done anything to provide extra support to the student to help them move on to be on grade level. They might just say, you need to go back to class and just try this one thing, easy thing. The team gathers the information to work through the problem process. They identify the area of need and what has been done to this point. The team does not immediately send the student for special ed evaluation. They need to determine the student's response to intervention. So the team members can change depending on the student, and the team works through a problem-solving approach to assist the student. They're not going to wait for the student to keep failing. So the student assistance process, the team uses an approach that makes sense to school personnel. It's a logical process. It's research-based. It's not just oh, let's try this idea. There is discussion based on school staff experience. What have you tried with the student that works? What could we do? Utilize teachers' daily data. They take the teacher's information into account as part of the problem-solving method, and they involve the parent. The team gathers information, usually from the person that brought the student forward. Hopefully the parents included from the beginning, and others may be added as information is gathered and they need somebody else's expertise. The team identifies the problem, whether it's an academic problem, a behavior problem. They get specifics. How long has the student been having difficulty? They look at the data, assessment results from in the classroom, observations from the teacher relevant to the issue. And they ask if any supports have been put into place, if the teacher's tried anything to assist the student to be successful. Depending on what things have already been happening in the classroom, the team makes a plan and determines a plan using response to intervention. The team decides on a specific intervention to use with the student. Then they decide who will provide the intervention. The classroom teacher, a counselor, a social worker. It just depends on the situation. And then they decide how long the intervention will be done, how it's going to be checked or progress monitored, and when the team will reconvene to review the information to determine whether the student's progressing or not progressing, and what the next steps might be. So we discussed the SAT's role in the response to intervention process. So we're going to look at that process. There are some different models, but the one that's used frequently is a three-tiered approach. So it's a multi-tiered process to identify, early support, and monitor the progress of students that are struggling to meet grade level expectations. The purpose is to improve school-wide instruction and increase support for at-risk learners and to decrease the number of children that may need special ed services. If they get interventions provided in the classroom and they get brought back up to grade level, they may not need special education. The difference between the old and the new is that the focus is on identifying students before they fail and providing interventions to support them so that they understand and progress. Remember the diagram a few slides back? This supports that data. Tier 1 would be used if students have some difficulty after the initial instruction. This is support to the entire class. It's just part of the regular teacher's methods that just happen as their regular teaching. They don't do anything special or break into groups or focus on any one individual student. Tier 2 is for those students that still are having difficulty with concepts after the teacher has done a quick review of the information, answered questions, done extra practice worksheet, or done a review activity with the whole class. This would be extra strategies provided to those students that did not pick up the material from the teacher's work with the entire class. Remember those 5 to 10%. Tier 3 would be for the students that still have difficulty after that initial information was provided and after receiving some extra work more focused and possibly small group instruction to re-explain the information. So the three-tier model identifies struggling students before they fall behind. It's a systematic approach for providing students interventions. So Tier 1 is quality classroom instruction based on the curriculum. You're teaching the curriculum, you're providing practice, you're just doing things that are regular and making sure the students are getting the concepts. Tier 2 is more focused supplemental instruction for those students that still aren't quite picking it up. And Tier 3 is an intensive intervention that's specifically designed to meet an individual student's needs, almost like special ed. So if they make it to this Tier 3, they are probably going to be evaluated for special education because you're trying something individual with that student to see if it actually works if they're in an individualized setting. So Tier 1 is the lowest level of intervention for student. It's usually provided in the classroom by the gen ed teacher, just something kind of basic. You progress monitor the student's progress to determine the next steps, and if the student's not progressing to grade level, then they may have to, the team would determine that they would move to a Tier 2 intervention if that's necessary. So once the Tier 1 is put into place, they do it for a specific amount of time. It's progress monitored, so the student's assessed. How are they progressing? If they're doing fine and they go back to grade level, the team will probably just place them back in gen ed and they'll keep an eye on them. If the student's still having difficulty, the team will probably determine that you need to go to Tier 2. So Tier 1 is for all students. It's scientifically based curriculum. It's the curriculum, you use curriculum-based information. You could group them, multiple grouping formats to meet students' needs if you needed to. And usually the time period in a class is 90 minutes a day. It's benchmark assessed because there's benchmarks in classrooms and you assess the student at the beginning, middle, and end of the academic year to see how they're progressing. Usually it's the general ed teacher who does it, and it's usually in the general ed setting that those are happening. So like I said, if the student's struggling just with after the basic pieces are done in a regular classroom, the SAT team probably determines they need a Tier 2. And that supports individual students who have not met the benchmarks through a whole class model. It targets students who have significantly lower levels of performance than their peers. So you kind of pull that group aside. It's students who exhibit significant deviation from their grade level peers. Students who are learning at a much slower rate than their grade level peers and falling farther behind their classmates. Tier 2 is supplemental instruction at least every 2 weeks, so the student's getting something extra in addition to the time allotted for core instruction. So if they're having a math problem, every couple weeks they get a little supported instruction for that. Instructions provided to the same ability small group, so it's with a group of students who are struggling, of no more than 3 to 5 students at least every 2 weeks. Tier 2 includes programs, strategies, and procedures designed and employed to supplement, enhance, and support whatever was taught in Tier 1, or just the regular curriculum that's happening in the classroom. And it's progress monitored. You always have to monitor the progress so you know whether the intervention is working or not working, to determine whether the student needs to go to the next step or whether they're doing all right and they can be put back into the regular class, like without the supplemental instruction. This is for students identified with marked difficulties and who have not responded to Tier 1. Program strategies and procedures designed and employed to supplement and enhance the Tier 1. It's usually small group instruction. 3 students, 4 students, or maybe 5 students with the teacher. It's a minimum of 30 minutes a day, so you do it more often than Tier 1. And it's 2 to 3 times per week in small groups in addition to their regular instruction. It's progress monitored at least twice a month, and you check on their skills to ensure that they're progressing and learning. And then it's determined by the SAT team whether or not it's working. And the appropriate setting is designated. They might have to go to the library or go to a smaller, quieter room to do the intervention. So it's a little more focused. It's increased intensity, supplemental. It's one-to-one or small group. It's progress monitored. This is Tier 3. Tier 3 is the last stage of the intervention model, and it's the most intensive. So it can go to one-on-one instruction if needed. It's for students identified with marked difficulties and who have not responded to Tier 1 or Tier 2 efforts. It's sustained, intensive, scientifically based interventions. The interventions aren't just picked out of the sky. They're specifically proposed things that the instructor that's given the responsibility is designated to do with the student. It's usually small group, 1-to-1, 1-to-2, no more than 3 students. It's a minimum of 30 minutes per day in small group or individually in addition to the core instruction. You don't pull them out of the core instruction, you still allow them to do that. It's progress monitored twice a week or at a minimum weekly on target skills to ensure adequate progress in learning. And personnel is determined by the SAT team, and it's an appropriate setting by the school, and it may or may not be in the classroom. So what are the interventions that are proposed? There are targeted assistance. So an example might be you could do the instruction in individual, small group, or it can be technology assisted. So it could be a computer program that they have to do, but somebody has to be monitoring it. You could teach additional learning strategies like organizational skills, work habits. You can change the curriculum a little bit. You could add intensive one-to-one or small group instruction. You can change the scope or sequence of the task to break it down a little bit. You can increase guided and independent practice. You might change the type and method of the feedback. So if they're supposed to be checking their own work, the teacher might be checking it, or there may be some kind of sheet that they use to check their feedback. Might be modifying modes of task presentation. Maybe instead of a lot of auditory or a lot of lecture, you do a visual presentation for the student. You have to cue work habits, like you might say to them, go ahead and get started on this. Modify direct instructional time. You might do pacing, like read for 2 minutes or do this for a certain amount of time. There might be partner reading. They might have to correct their own mistakes. You increase the structure of the task that they're doing so it's more structured and not so flexible and on their own. So those are some of the interventions. And there are intervention packages that are provided that schools can buy to work on with students that have been proven to be effective. So interventions are specific strategies that are used with the student to help them succeed. They're progress monitored, and they're done for a specific amount of time, and then it's reviewed to see if the student has progressed or not progressed. Interventions are not moving the student's seat to the front, shortening their assignments, calling the parent, retaining the student, or punishing the student. Those are not interventions. So what happens if the student does not respond, and what's required? If a student is referred to the SAT and goes through Tier 2 and Tier 3 and is still not making progress, this is the point in time when they would be referred for special education evaluation. It's important to note that a parent can request an evaluation at any time in the process. The district must evaluate, but if they use the response to intervention method, they can let the parent know that the team may not have enough data without going through the response to intervention process to determine that the student is eligible. They may go through a special education evaluation and determine that the student is not eligible, and then have to go through the RTI process. So you want to make sure that the teacher's aware, or the parent's aware of that. A big piece of the process is the read. The SAT can complete a read or a review of existing evaluation data, so what data is available right now to look at for the student, without consent from the parent, as this is an information gathering process and not an evaluation. Once again, hopefully the parent has been brought into the process. So the read's not required for an initial determination for eligibility, but it is best practice. And the regulation is 300-305, and it talks through in additional requirements for evaluation. The read is the process that's used to look at the current information that is known about the student. Is there enough data to complete the multi-factored evaluation form and have evidence to support the eligibility criteria that the student must meet in order to be eligible? The student assistance team or the multi-factored evaluation team needs to decide if they have enough information or if they need to complete more evaluations in order to be able to find the student eligible, or to go through the requirements and have evidence that there is a disability or there's not a disability. This process can be confusing, so there are guidance documents available to help the team ask the right questions and determine if they have the right information, or if they need more current or extra information or assessments to help determine eligibility. The read forms and guidance documents can be found in Doc Sharing. And I'm also going to try to put them in the weekly unit if it'll work. If not, they will be in Doc Sharing. So after the read, what happens? And we're going to talk about that in the next PowerPoint. So if you have any questions about what was presented, please contact me, post questions in the virtual office or in the discussion board.